Hey everyone, before we get started, quick announcement. Jeanne Liedtka will be running a masterclass in practical experimentation for Future Skills Academy, October 9th in Amsterdam. If you're interested, let us know. Send an email to info@futureskills.academy. That is info@futureskills.academy.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Creative Leaders Unplugged. I'm Morgan, here with Arna, and a podcast brought to you by Future Skills Academy. Okay, so today we're talking to Jeanne Liedtka, and she's a professor of business administration at the University of Virginia, and also a thought leader, an author, a teacher.
Yeah,
An
she's one of
innovator.
my heroes. She's really one of my heroes. She gave us language. She gave us business language and books that we can show to our clients saying, see,
What we're doing is real and
it's
valid.
real. It's from the world of the academic world, and it's from the business world, and it's a professor, and so she writes books about this. So it must be true. Believe us, we told you. And it made a difference. It made a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, and this podcast I think is really great if you're interested in not only she talks about her new book.
Experimentation field book. It's the experimentation field book. Yeah, it's a step-by-step project guide. Well, it's a very useful book for people who, are confused by what we talked about, the front end of innovation and sort of design thinking, and then need to kind of start thinking about implementation, and you
Mhm.
need to do some experimentation, and experimentation is also scary and not as sexy as the front end of design thinking. So I think it's one of those missing links
Yeah.
that we needed. Yeah.
Yeah, and so she talks about that. She also talks about design thinking and the role that it plays in businesses and how she's used her role as a business professor and her interest in design and how she's translated these things to make them more accessible to other people.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
were the
And
other
what I
interesting?
really thought was interesting is that her kind of she always starts with this, I am not a creative. So I always looked at creative people and designers and artists, with such admiration, but I'm not a creative. And then she started talking about how she does things, and you're like, you're extremely creative. You're a
Yeah.
creative thinker. You're a connector. You connect these things that are not connected yet, and that's design. That's creativity. So it's kind of funny, like,
Yeah,
yeah,
that was exactly
books.
my thought process as well when she was sharing more.
Yeah,
And yeah.
exactly.
And she really talks about how systems influence how we do things.
Yeah,
And one of the other things that struck me was then the the role of the designer. You know, we're teaching design thinking and these design mindsets to more people, but then what is the role of the designer? And I thought she gave a really fabulous answer there as well.
yeah. Okay. Enjoy.
Yes, enjoy.
I was looking into at some of the video, because there's so many interviews with you on YouTube. so I was kind of going through them a little bit, which was also interesting. And that kind of did strengthen my belief that if people really want to know what you do for work and for for design thinking and your books, and there's so much out there.
Mhm. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
right there. There's no shortage of me captured on video floating around our world.
Exactly.
Sometimes I
Um,
think way too much. Whenever I make a new one, I'm like, really? Do we
yeah,
need more of me on video out there?
exactly. Yeah. It's funny. And it's funny because over time, you've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, right.
So right.
Exactly.
So so you
The
can go back.
hairdos, the hairdos and styles alone are entertaining
Exactly.
at this
Yeah.
point in time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. So yeah, that would be good at parties. That'd be
Yeah,
fine. You can kind of create some kind of a collection of them and go like, look at that.
right, through the years.
Yeah. Okay. Which is something we all have, by the way. Sorry, my brain went to my kids and go like, my kids will have even my kids that will be worse because my
Oh,
daughter, she's been like stuff, photos online, Instagram for
Yeah.
like her
yep,
whole life.
Yep.
yep,
So,
Yep.
so anyway,
yeah.
my first question, sorry, but then we're going to start. My first question is if you meet someone, that person they haven't been on YouTube, so they don't know who you are, and they are also really interested in your work, in your profession, in your the books that you wrote, um and they want to know who you are. Who are you?
I guess at my heart of hearts, I'm a teacher, um, and explorer in some ways. And what I'm about is, I think, helping people find the kind of creative person that I know is in them, even if they don't know it sometimes. So, um, I think I think that's kind of where I've ended up over the years. I've I've almost always been a teacher. I've been a teacher now for 40 years, a professor, and I've taught different things. Um, there's no question that teaching the design materials is the most fun teaching I've gotten to do, because so often I do most of my work with people who don't think of themselves as creative people. So,
Mm.
they're all non-designers. They may be business people, they may be doctors or nurses, they may be school teachers, but generally they're the kind of people who've been told their whole life that they are not the creative ones. And so these design tools just, help us find the creative person within us, who is buried more deeply for many of us than for others, right?
Mm. Sure,
Um,
sure, sure.
and so that's just incredibly gratifying. Before that, I taught strategy, and I
Yeah.
loved teaching strategy too, and helping people develop strategic thinking skills, and help them to look at the world in new ways. But that isn't as fulfilling as kind of this kind of work, which I think it changes who people are. You're
So can I ask you a question about the exploring? So one of the things because I heard you say in one of the interviews that I listened to, faculty members are secretly exploring their inadequacies. What is so you have been exploring, so you started with, I'm an explorer. And so my question is, after all those years of exploring, because I also heard you say that you are not educated as a creative, you're probably not the
not.
most creative person, but after all that, but you believe that everyone's a creative, and after all those years of exploring, are you a creative now?
I think I have found ways to express my creativity. I mean, it's not the kind of creativity. I think, I think in part that's why I've loved studying designers, because that skill has fascinated me. Still, the skill of visualization fascinates me, that
Mhm.
people are able to um, create imagery and tell stories. And I mean, that's kind of always been something that's fascinated me. And I'm not any better at visualization than I ever was.
But when
um
did you
but
start becoming fascinated? When was the first time you went like, huh, you know, very creative people, or creativity, or what was the first time you
Good
felt?
question. Yeah.
yeah, I think I've always been fascinated by creative people, by artistic people in particular.
Mm.
I have no musical talent myself, but I always say that if I had one wish in the world, it would be that I would suddenly develop the gift of playing the piano. Right? I find it almost miraculous when you listen to an incredible musician, or when you read a novel of someone that that can just write so beautifully. That I think I've always been in awe of those people. And I think for a while when I was first in college, I tried taking, creative writing and things like that. And I pretty quickly found that I was just not very good at it, right? Compared to the other people. Whereas there were a set of things that I was very good at compared to other people, but those turned out to be things like accounting, right? I mean, my undergraduate major was accounting, and I clearly had a gift for accounting that a lot of other people didn't have. But it wasn't anything like these gifts that people had for creative expression through music and art and things like that. So I've always been fascinated by them, and always, I think, found lacking in myself, or had, I don't even know that I spent a lot of time feeling lacking in myself, harbored this desire to be one of those people and to have those gifts, right? And yet I went to business school, my undergraduate's in accounting. I did my MBA. I turned out to be particularly good at strategy and strategic thinking. And strategic thinking is its own kind of creativity in some ways, but not the same kind, and it didn't ever really feel that way to me. But I kind of just accepted that, and I accepted the way it was, that I was not one of those people, and that I never would be. But I always remained fascinated by them, and so when. And I was fascinated by architecture for a long time. Architecture was really my entrance into design, because I became very interested in the idea of architecture, the architectural process, as a metaphor for the strategic planning process. So
Ooh.
one of the things that I found in my world was I had this notion of people who do strategy as doing something very precious and very important, essentially as designing the future of their organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when I taught people, we had such a mundane view of strategy. I mean, people thought of it in terms of strategic plans and things like that, right? Extrapolations, Excel spreadsheets. I mean, a whole set of things. And none of it had this kind of powerful, future focused kind of visionary notion of strategy. I mean, entrepreneurs had that. So you could read the stories of entrepreneurs who see things that others didn't. But for me, I felt like every manager that I taught had the ability to really enact this much more powerful future than the one they were living in. And architecture, the architectural process, I think, was the first place I noticed a corollary, concrete thing happening that seemed to be, it might act as a metaphor to people. So I was really trying to inspire managers to think of themselves as architects of the future, and of organizations as kind of spaces they were creating to help them do that. So for a long time, we have a very powerful story of architectural creation here at the University of Virginia, which was founded by Thomas Jefferson. And our campus is the only World Heritage site in the US that is a built environment in that way, right?
Wow.
Yeah, it's very unique because it was designed by Jefferson, and it was driven by this vision Jefferson had of what education looked like for democracy. So at that time, universities were all built on the European model, right? Very hierarchical, focused on esoteric subjects, Latin, Greek, these kinds of things. And Jefferson viewed all that kind of education as education for people who lived with kings and in totalitarian regimes. He didn't feel that kind of education prepared people to be citizens in a democracy. So he was very interested in exploring alternative views of education. And in many ways, the most dramatic parts of UVA are the academic design. He believed in student self-governance to a great extent. He believed that people should be able to study whatever they want. So he brought in a lot of science and architecture and all of these skills that would not have been thought of as appropriate for higher education. And, he has these famous quotes like, at the University of Virginia, people should feel free to pursue truth wherever it takes them, right? So he didn't allow them to build a chapel on campus because he believed that in a very Enlightenment sense, that the true religion of an academic institution was the pursuit of truth, and that notions of God didn't belong in the university in that way. So we didn't actually have a chapel on our grounds until the Victorian times. But it's very early in the 1820s or so, and so he's building UVA, and he's an old man by then, and so he's the author of the Declaration of Independence, and all of this is these views. Now, I mean, what we do today, looking at his life through the prism of our world today, he was a slave holder, and this notion of all men are created with an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness only really counted for a small number of white men who owned land. So it was a very narrow version, but within that version, it was a very enlightened version. So he designed the University of Virginia to be his notion of what education for citizens of a democracy look like, and he physically built it to mirror that. So he had attended schools that were largely big buildings, and he built UVA to be a village. He called it the academical village, and he felt that students and faculty should live together in a very egalitarian kind of way. So he designed this village on what we call the lawn. It has the rotunda at one end, which was the library, which was kind of replaced his notion of the chapel. And down each side of the lawn, there are a set of pavilions where the faculty lived upstairs and had their classrooms downstairs. And in between are the rooms where the students lived. So he had this notion, and he believed in student self-governance. We still have a student-administered honor code here at UVA. There were just lots of aspects that were really unique. So I would take managers on an architectural tour. We had an amazing architectural historian at the time who was a Jefferson scholar. He did all the PBS specials of Jefferson, and he had the bow tie and all, and he looked like a historian of Jefferson should look. People loved him. And he would take us on a tour of the university, and he would talk about Jefferson's vision for education and how that was embodied in the physical space of the grounds. So where you saw this beautiful World Heritage physical space, which of course was also spared during the Civil War when they burned most of the South, the Union general who got to Charlottesville was a believer in Jefferson and would not burn anything that Jefferson had created. So it's unusual to have things from the 1820s that were in the path of Sherman's March to the Sea. So we take them on this tour, and the message was, look, okay, we're not Jefferson, we're not designing the future of democracy, but you're designing the future for your organization. And as a leader, what is your vision? How do you embody your vision? Not just on the physical side, but in the information systems you build. It's all the systems and structure and process and infrastructure that organizations put in place. They do it to evoke a particular kind of behavior, the way Jefferson designed UVA to evoke a particular behavior on the part of students.
Exactly.
That would accumulate. So that was a big influence for me. And that was where I started. So I tried reading architecture. And
it's interesting if I can connect to that, please. Because architecture, we've been talking about architecture on the podcast a few times, actually. And so this reminds me, and I'm sorry for all the listeners who've heard this story before, but I do really want to connect this to this. Someone we also both know, David Kester, was on the podcast a while ago.
Yes.
And David told this story about how he was, when he was a kid, he lived in this building, and the building, sort of the apartment block, was actually created, it was created by a company, and they thought that their workers would live there. So the company built these apartments for their employees. But the company, it never worked. I think the war kind of, I think the Second World War kind of messed up the plans. But then the apartment buildings were there, and it was designed for a communal experience. It was all designed, the architect created a building so the people who would live there would be sort of get a sense of community. So it was sold to families, not to the workers, to the families. And so David, and as a kid and with his parents, they moved in, and he had a communal experience because the architecture kind of
Invited it.
invited it and created this kind of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. It had these. So that from that, I was so interested in that story because also to what to your point, if you connect that to businesses, if you say, well, that's a house, that's a building, it has maybe it's not all physical walls, but it has systems, it has walls, it has sort of, so the way you design your building, your company, that creates a culture, that creates behavior. If you do that purposely, if you know what you want to have as a culture and as an environment and as a behavior, then you have to build your company that way. But often it's not that way. It's almost like the culture is almost like an afterthought. It's like we follow the sort of the rules we were taught, or at least we copy the way companies have been built since the Industrial Revolution. And that's what we were going to copy. And then all of a sudden we were going to tell people that we want them to be more creative or entrepreneurial or, or agile or whatever the buzzword is at the time. And then they're surprised that people don't.
Yeah.
And I think it's such an interesting connection between architecture, to your point, and how we want people to behave.
Yeah. And I mean, and again, we could think of architecture as a physical space. When we think of organizations, it is physical. I mean, any teacher will tell you the design of the classroom makes a huge difference in what you can accomplish in terms of learning in it. But it's also a psychological space, right? It's a structural space in terms of systems and process and all of that. And it's a space that in totality evokes, and well, it makes some ways of behaving much easier than others, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what a system does, right? And we know that when you put people in a system, regardless of what you ask for, they generally do what the system rewards.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So when you try and change things, if you just change one thing and you leave the system in place, but you ask people to be creative, I mean, this is what we hear all the time. We leave the existing system in place, we ask people to be creative, and then we're surprised when they behave the way they've always behaved, because the system is the same system as it always was.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And so it's a very powerful metaphor, I think, in architecture. I started trying to read the work of architects who were really thoughtful about their process, which it turns out there aren't a lot of, right? I mean, I would say probably Richard Gere was the most thoughtful. He was the most influential at that point because he spoke at length about the Guggenheim Bilbao and the evolution of the Guggenheim Bilbao. And again, you have this notion of iteration and response to opportunity and just a completely different creative process than we would normally talk about in strategic planning, certainly. And so I would also have students read the story of Gere and the Guggenheim Bilbao. We would read about the design of Central Park in the US, which is a very interesting design story too, of how you balance possibility, constraint, and uncertainty, right? So the design theory, it was wonderful for all these things, but it was just a metaphor. There were no tools. I mean, I looked and looked and looked. Architects didn't really have tools that I could teach to business people that would be helpful to them, right? And so at some level, as a teacher, metaphor only gets you so far. I could put people in a different conceptual space, but then I couldn't equip them with a clear set of tools to actually get there, right? And I would never have gotten there with architecture, I'm pretty convinced, because I mean, only recently does our architecture school even acknowledge design thinking, right? I mean, architects still operate with the great man theory. Many of them, you got it, or you don't have it, and architects are designing for themselves, not for other people. And so in many ways, I was frustrated And then I can't recall how design thinking came across my attention span, probably because I was reading in the design field generally. And I thought, wait a minute, these are actual tools. I mean, journey mapping is a tool. I can work with that. I can teach people how to journey map, and they can take this notion of what's the ideal experience we're trying to create, and they actually can, in a very tactile, clear way, be able to try and move towards thinking about how to actually do it, right? And so I got very excited about the design thinking tool set. But when you talk to designers, it was just something they did, right? And if you ask people, so lay out your process for me, it was so intuitive, right? And so I think it often takes someone for whom something is distinctly not intuitive to play a translational role.
Yes.
So I think it was a combination of, I admired the work of creative people so much. I was very driven to understand it. And they found it difficult to articulate what they did. But to someone who lived in a different world, if you watched what they did, it was clearly very different in ways that you could capture and write down, right? And I think that was all of my original work, just trying to take these design tools and processes that were so intuitive in the design world and try and codify and translate them and simplify them into something simple enough that people who weren't trained in design could do, right?
Yeah.
And certain things you could do that well with. You can't do it with visualization. I mean, now with AI, we can. The computer will do it for us. But, you can't take someone who's had no training in design and have them be good at visualization with, physically. That it doesn't. But you can teach them to do ethnographic interviewing. You can teach them to look for insights. You can teach them how to brainstorm much more effectively and creatively and co-create with people who think differently than they do. You can teach them how to do simple prototyping. I mean, there was just this beautiful set of very teachable processes that I saw when designers talked that they weren't able to really articulate. And I think that was the path I started on. I was just trying to create materials for the mostly business school students I was teaching to make this amazing fuzzy thing accessible to them. Right. And so that was just, I got on that path, and I happened to get on that path at a time when business people were starting to notice design thinking and thinking this looks like a good thing, but people didn't know how to do it.
And that would have been early 2000s, right?
Yeah, that would have been early 2000s. So we started the MBA class. I think the MBA class is about 15 years old now.
Okay.
So, and it took a couple of years before I had the guts to actually call it a class at the business school. So the first paper I wrote, academic paper, was called Strategy as a Metaphor for Design. And that was published in 1999. So I was interested in design, but it took a lot of years. And at the same time, I happened to bump into Roger Martin's work. He was doing at Rotman, where he was trying to do the same thing. And the crazy thing was, Roger and I were MBA students together. So we knew each other from way, 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 way back. And simultaneously, we converged on this design space, right? And he was really trying to turn Rotman School at the University of Toronto into the school that did this. So he thought a lot about it and had really put in place some structures to think about it. So I kind of just hitched onto his coattails, and with what they were doing in Toronto, since it was only me doing it here at UVA. And I mean, there were virtually no other business schools really trying to do this stuff seriously. Berkeley was doing some of it, but only with non-tenure track people. There were almost no traditional academics in any business school you could find who were doing design thinking stuff.
I think the community, the sort of if you call it the design thinking and / service design community, which is basically the same community, became, I think, aware of you, most of them through the book Designing for Growth.
I know.
I think
Yeah.
that became a kind of a, for a lot of design folks, creative folks, like, hey, wait a minute, that's that's really cool. That's someone from the academic world, and from the US also, that must be said,
Yeah.
because there have been sort of people writing about service design, which, you know, when you talk about journey mapping and like, it's the same toolkit. But designing for growth was sort of something that really connected to, and I think, was that 2011 or so, something like that.
2011 is Designing for Growth,
Yeah,
because I had written a book called The Catalyst in 2009, which was
right.
based a pretty significant academic study of growth leaders. So it studied, because as a strategist, what people really want you to tell them is how to grow their business, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the MBAs don't care; they don't have businesses to grow. But when you start like talking to managers in the real world, they basically want a set of tools to grow their business. And the reality was there were no tools. There were all kinds of tools for evaluating whether a business was good or not,
Right.
but there were literally no tools for generating new business ideas. You were
That's
just,
astounding.
yeah, well, you had brainstorm, but brainstorming then consisted of get in a room and shout ideas at a whiteboard with none of the front end of design thinking, where you're
Yeah.
actually learning about your customers and you're brainstorming out of customer driven design criteria. No. It's just like impose your own thoughts on what everyone should need and yell them at. It was just incredibly primitive. And so I wrote this book that studied these people who were in large organizations and who were consistently growing their businesses much faster than the markets they operated in. And they behaved completely differently than other people. Now, what they were doing was they were kind of intuitively doing what a design thinking person would do, right? They were having conversations with customers that were much more empathic than what the traditional business survey would do. They were learning through action with small experiments. They were bringing diverse groups of people from across the organization together to try and find breakthrough ideas. We didn't have a name for what they were doing, but we started paying attention to the behaviors, so that when design thinking showed up, it was clear that they were
Yeah.
just a codification of the behaviors that we were already seeing in managers. So I knew that they would work if we could just figure out how to teach them. Because
Yeah.
the trouble with the growth managers was they were designers at heart.
Yeah.
They too did all this stuff intuitively. So they never had a class in design thinking. They just knew that it was better to go out and talk to customers and inquire about their lives than it was to mail them a survey. You know, I mean, but they didn't have any logic behind that or any method. It was just, I just like to talk to people. And they had by themselves often changed careers a lot. So they had a very broad repertoire to draw from when they were looking. So we got really excited about design thinking, and I felt that if I could figure out how to teach it to business people, because it was terrifying to them. I mean, there's the basic premise of stepping into the unknown, and committing to tackle a problem that you cannot currently see an answer to. It was just completely intimidating. But I thought if we can make it safe for them, they will really benefit. It will speak for itself. It will work, but we just have to get people to do it. And it was about that time that I met Tim Ogilvy, I was teaching. It's so funny because I was teaching a class, and we were supposed to be doing something on ethnographic interviewing and insights. And I had arranged for a designer to come and teach in that class because I knew I couldn't teach that stuff. It was teaching the basics of journey mapping and stuff. And the person that had agreed to come and teach it backed out at like the last minute. They got like a better offer from somebody else. It was outrageous. So I was left with like 3 days to the class and something that I couldn't teach. And I put all these executives in a room. And this person was like, well, there's this guy who might be free. Why don't you call him? And I almost didn't call him because I was so furious about it. But I called him and he showed up, and he was so much better at explaining it than any designer I'd ever seen. And of course, Tim is an engineer by training. So even though he started up the design firm and he has all of the designerly qualities, at heart, he's still an engineer.
Yeah.
So he could explain these things in a way that were so much clearer to business people. And so we just started, I started writing stuff down. I had already formulated the 4 questions without him. I just didn't know how to teach them and how to map them to tools. So he started helping me map them to tools. And we wrote that book just because I didn't have any teaching materials for the MBAs and the business. Literally, I wrote that book basically as a course book, right? So that I could have something to teach from. Because when designers write about design, you either had like the IDEO books, the great man books, where they talked about all the fabulous things that were produced by their design, but they never ever told you how to do it.
Yeah.
So there was no one telling you how to do it. They were just telling you it was great and that they were doing it and getting great results, right? So I think, that book just, it filled a void that at the time, and like 3 years later, there were lots of people writing about that. It just happened that at that moment, there were not many people.
So if I can make an observation, so it's so interesting that you started talking about how you, when you were younger, you kind of, you felt that you weren't the creative person, and you were at all with, all these creative. I hear you talk, you are one of the most creative people I know, because creativity is about connecting things that are not connected.
Related.
Connecting things, connecting people, seeing a concept here and a concept there, saying, hey, I should bring that together. That's design. That's what designers do. And I think one of the things that you do that I also feel that is sort of a, there's a new, and maybe even it was the T-shaped people that I think Tim Brown kind of coined that term of the T-shaped version, but that idea of someone being sort of outside of the bubbles, the expertises, but sort of being in that, what I call the space in between, but being able to say, hey, wait a minute, that space should be connected to that. So architecture, and there's the business people, and there's this design, and there's these, and there's teaching, how do I connect it, and how, et cetera, and then that is a creative. That there is nothing else that designers or creatives do. Maybe they have the craft of drawing or being whatever, visualizing it, but that's a craft. To me, that's a craft. That's not per se being the most creative person, because some people can draw, but they're boring. Because they're not innovative. They're not, you're an innovator. Right? So no, I'm just an observation. Go like, what do you mean you're not a creative? You are the most creative person out.
It's a different notion, creativity, isn't it? But what's funny is that synthesis. It's really synthesizing there. So that's the core skill there. That is the core skill in strategy as well. So I think that's why it worked in some ways, because what you needed to be good at for strategy was synthesizing, right? You had to take different functions and different opportunities and different environments, and you had to be able to find the path that made the most sense at the intersection of those. So strategy is always about intersection. And early on when I was reading design, I'm still the world's biggest Richard Buchanan fan. I think Richard, as in the scholarly literature, always wrote more beautifully about design than anyone else I read. And when he wrote that great design happens at the intersection of possibility, constraint, and uncertainties.
Exactly.
That is the best description for successful business strategy that was ever written.
Yes.
And our problem in business, though, is we start with constraints, and design starts with possibilities, right? And if you start with constraints, the creativity pretty much gets cut off right away, right? Because what's possible in a constrained world is what we've already got, right? And it's that pushing yourself to ask what's in some ways impossible, but something really important to do, that is what opens up the creative energy to break trade-offs and these kinds of things. So some of it was very rooted in strategy. I just had never recognized that. But that's been my only contribution to design world. When I first found out that designers were buying the book, I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard, because I felt as though everything in that book I had been taught by designers, that there was no reason for a designer to buy that book.
Can I
right?
tell you? Can you tell you a secret? I'll tell you a secret. We didn't buy your book to read the book. We bought the book to give it to our clients.
To give it to your client. I eventually figured that out.
No, we read it, but we were like, oh, it is really cool. But you gave us
And
no.
we know all this stuff.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
we do, but we didn't have the language. It's exactly to your point. So exactly what you were saying. We needed people to make that bridge, to
Yeah.
give us the language. So in my company, I also, one of my partners was also someone who came from the world of MBAs, and I work with an engineer, and so I need those people to be able to translate my fuzzy kind of brain, my thoughts, into something that business people understand. So it makes it safe for them. The tools also, the tools, I always say, these beautiful canvases and these journey maps and they are only there for people who are insecure about creativity, and it makes it look like we thought about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just seems like we really put some thought in it, and it's on a, oh, it's printed and it's designed. There are lines and there's words. We don't use them. We don't use these. I've never created a journey map for my own company, for myself. Never done so. I tried it because why don't I do it? But then I'm distracted again. I do other things and I just keep going. So it's a sense of psychological safety that we create in the design also of our interaction with business. And your books, are for us like, see,
It's real. There's a book about it.
Jeanne Liedtka says so. And then our clients say, oh, well, if Jeanne Liedtka said it, then all right.
If a business school professor, I have really milked the business school professor thing for all it's worth. Really.
As you should.
Often I think that, no one would have given me the time of day, except it was hard to find a business school professor who was talking about this stuff. I was about it, in the normal academics talking about this stuff. And so it was wonderful. But, it's also the emotional piece. I think there are aspects of design that to a designer seem just so normal, like how else would you do something? To the business world, were completely revolutionary.
Yeah.
I mean, this idea that, you actually manifest with imagery, right? I mean, prototyping, simple storyboards and stuff, those are like game changers often in business, right? But our notion of prototyping always came out of research and development, which was a prototype was, an MVP. It was like a finished thing that engineers created. It was, in classic charades terms, it was your dress rehearsal. This notion that prototyping was a way of sparking a better conversation to get better feedback from customers, and all you needed was a simple little storyboard, and not to try and sell them. I mean, these were revolutionary concepts to business people. The emotional connection thing. I mean, it's taken me years to unpack why design thinking changes business people. It changes. The reason why design thinking works is not because we create different stuff for customers. It's because it changes who we are first, and the new person we are creates better stuff for customers, right? And if you understand the complexity of the design thinking skill set, when you start to put the front end of design, which is all about emotional connection, and the back end of testing, which is all about emotional detachment and evidence and data, those don't fit together well with very many people, right? Those are hard things to put together. So it's a very complex skill set, and it's unpacking the complexity of the skill set and what that skill set does to people as they actually immerse themselves, for instance, in the lives of another, or they actually brainstorm in a structured way in a diverse group according to a set of rules that force people to be positive and build on each other rather than critique. These are all massive game changers in reality. They don't sound like much when you talk about them, but for businesses to adopt these, it is huge. And I think it's why we continue to struggle. I mean, design thinking is still aspirational in most organizations. I mean, we've been talking about it and doing, workshops and all of that kind of stuff for years and years and years. And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of its real potential, because it's so rare that we do it as it's meant to be done. But even a little of it really helps. I mean, that's the amazing thing about it. I mean, as we look at the return on investment, I mean, and we've spent a fair amount of time in more recent years trying to actually calibrate a return on investment for business people. So to actually help them understand design thinking, not as this kind of magic box, but as producing a predictable set of results. I mean, it produces these mechanisms that in turn produce things like better sales, lower costs, great, more effective collaboration. And so we've been trying to unpack those in a really systematic way, because there's no mystery about why it works. If you look at psychology, if you look at cognitive science, I mean, design thinking just does a bunch of stuff that we already knew was absolutely essential to good decision making and problem solving. We just never really had good tools to do it, and we still don't do it much, but it's still, I always swear, teaching someone journey mapping. If you take a manager and you teach them journey mapping, they will go back and find and have a way to improve their business. 100% certainty. If they go back and do it, they will get a result. There's a predictability about the system when you do it at a system level that is very unusual. And we treat it as though it's woo-woo and fuzzy, but in fact, done well and systematically, it has almost absolute predictability.
And so that, I mean, because what you're saying, it makes so much sense in what you're saying, but then also when I think of how we're bringing this to people who aren't designers, right? We're giving them workshops, we're bringing them tools, we're giving them really helpful and insightful books, but at their heart, they're still the person they are. They're still a teacher. They're still a business person. They're still, you can teach someone to dance, but they might not be a dancer. So how do you view the difference or the value between teaching people these tools, because you're also talking about the fundamental power of it's changing them as a person as well, versus then bringing an actual designer on board, not just to lead a workshop or to teach them these skills?
Yeah, well, I think it depends what we're designing, right? I mean, I don't think anyone's teaching a bunch of business people how to actually design a product or service. I mean, that's just, you're teaching it, I'm teaching it as a problem-solving process, right? That improves, so you're using the tools, but you're not using them in the deep, sophisticated way a designer would use them. You're using them as triggers to different ways of thinking and behaving within the responsibility someone already has, right? So I know designers worry a lot, or did, about, you teach design thinking to a business person and then they think they don't need designers anymore. I think the reality of it is most people who actually learn design thinking appreciate designers far more than they used to. I mean, I will still continue to say designers are about the most, underpriced, valuable commodity in business today, right? Compared to like a strategy consultant. Think of what a strategy consultant costs and the likelihood that will actually pay off. A designer costs you a small fraction and brings like a revolutionary new way of thinking. They don't show up and give you an answer. They expose you, the best ones, to completely new ways of thinking and behaving. And so there's this category of designers. I think someone had intuited when I was writing a case study of them once, said there's two kinds of designers. There's designers who want to hoard it and designers who want to give it away. Designers who want to hoard it are very damaging in the business environment, right? Because they're all about, we're superior and we're doing something that you can't. And, the only people they don't extend empathy to is their actual business clients, from what I've heard, right? They don't appreciate what a struggle it is to come to terms with what they're saying. So they make people feel stupid, and untalented and not creative. I mean, the opposite of psychological safety, right?
Yeah.
But when you get a designer who wants to bring other people along with them and is really committed to that, there is no more productive person to have on a team, because they will bring people with them, right? There are things that you need designers to do for you, but a lot of the transformational potential of design thinking, I think, is having designers model and help other people to get better at these basic tools. So for me, if you really want to teach design thinking, what you need is kind of an apprentice program where the people that are trying to do this stuff after you've taught them in their workshop actually go back and they have a designer on the team who guides them through all those early pitfalls. I mean, there's a lot of big mistakes you can make early on that don't look big at the time in design.
Yeah.
If you don't have someone steering the ship, you're going to make mistakes that are going to take the whole project down, right? I mean, you define the problem incorrectly at the very beginning, and you can throw all the journey mapping you want. If you've defined the problem too narrowly, it's not going to work. I just think having designers along for the ride, and these companies like Intuit, whose model has been to bring designers in and then have them kind of seconded out to teams to help develop the skills in others. Those are the models that I think actually build the skills in organizations. You need designers in that world as well. So you need them to do the design work of projects and things like that. But you also need them to just model design behavior in an empathetic way.
Yeah.
That models and teaches it to other people and makes it feel like they can do it, or at least do enough of it that they can make a difference with it.
Yeah.
And that's powerful.
That's very powerful. And it also aligns very closely with the conversations Arna and I have been having, and also what I'm researching right now is the role of a designer as a facilitator, and not a facilitator in a one-off afternoon, but as an overall processes or organizational facilitator, especially when working with different like stakeholders and teams. So
Yeah, and I think we're still talking about sort of that kind of new, so the facilitator or the facilitative leader or the kind of people, because they don't need to be educated in design. I mean, they don't need to be, they can come from anywhere, but these are the kind of people that design on a different level. They design people, bringing them together. They design community, they design processes of design, creative process. They design the psychological safety, the safe spaces, the stakeholder involvement, and all those. And that's a skill that I've been teaching that to quite a lot of people, but I think that's not being taught enough, that it's not, so to be the facilitator of it. And it's not about a workshop. It's not facilitating a workshop. It might also be workshops, but it's actually also in between the workshops. It's also because the workshop is like brainstorming. There should be before and after, and there should be someone who is a coach. So I think a coaching part is, so something I've been seeing lately, also in my own role, that more and more I am doing some on-the-job coaching. So I would, so they come into a training, and this is something I'm doing right now. People come into a very short training, really, with their own project. So not a made up project. No, it's they come with a question, real challenge. They get some tools, some explanation. Then they try it and they get coaching. And they come back and they say, oh, I tried it, something went wrong. Okay, what went wrong? And so it's a long term. So we also are moving away from, but I came from the world of, 2-day fundamentals training, a week-long boot camp, a half a day training or whatever, very short. And then goodbye, good luck. I taught you journey mapping. So now you go
do it now.
Yeah. But which is obviously not possible, really. It's just, but and you might just even confuse people more. But so we're moving into, and also the clients are more willing to give us that role into a more coaching role, where we go like, okay, I will guide you long term, because because it's also about behavioral change, and it is about kind of crafting or creating this position within an organization that also your stakeholders will allow you that. So that system. So I think systemic kind of understanding, at least, or understanding of the system, and being able to say, wait a minute, we need to kind of also, understand the system that people are in, so we know why they're struggling, because journey mapping is not rocket science. Going out and talking to your customers is not rocket science. It's just, you have to go and do it, and then you'll notice, like, oh, wait a minute, it's really helpful. But then what do you do with the outcomes? And then et cetera, et cetera. So the complexities in the system, the architecture again. And so I think so to your point, we're at the start of something, but it's just the very beginning, and we can see it. But at the same time, we're in such a hurry. So people are like, oh yeah, design thinking, we tried it. It didn't
Yeah,
work.
exactly. Been there. No, I mean,
like,
that's the classic business treatment of anything new, right?
yeah, exactly.
Right? We made a half-hearted attempt. It didn't produce miracles in the first, 6 months we tried it. So what the hell? We'll go on to something. We used to call it the coffee mug phenomena. You get a coffee mug that says "I heart" whatever the thing, and 6 months later you put it in your bottom drawer and you get the new mug, which says something else.
Yeah.
It's absolutely a disease that organizations have. Right. And I mean, at least they're not prejudicial against design thinking. They do it to everything. Literally,
Yeah,
you can watch them do it. I mean, you go back to Peter Senge and the learning organization stuff. I mean, I worked with Peter in the early days and I watched that. That was some of the most powerful stuff I'd ever seen. I mean, if organizations only took that seriously and actually did it, I mean, they would be entirely reformed, but they bastardized it, right? I mean, they took it, it was hard to do. You look at stuff like his ladder of inquiry, it is much more complicated than a lot of the design tools. So it was harder to do. But it was still badly done. And then everyone patted themselves on the back for how well they trained everyone to do it. And, and that was it. It's really sad. I mean, I think that's why what I love most and what's really, I think, been for me, one of the most amazing things about design thinking is you actually can do it relatively well in an environment that doesn't support it, right? It's about starting small, and it's about changing what's in your sphere of control. So I can teach design thinking to a group of teachers, and normally they're waiting for the school system to tell them, oh yeah, we're all going to learn design thinking here, and now you've got approval, because so much of organizations, business organizations, are about asking for approval and waiting to do it. But with design thinking, it's like, you can walk into your classroom tomorrow and you can have a different kind of conversation with those kids, and you can change things in your world that will change the experience of other human beings. And you don't need permission to do that. You don't need a lot of money. You don't need all kinds of new rules. You don't need anything but the will and some rudimentary understanding of these new tools, and you can go do it. And, I just think it's very hard to reform organizations. If there's anything I've learned from, 40 years paying attention to large organizations, they are very resistant to doing things in new ways. But on the other hand, there's always a bunch of motivated people who are looking for new ways to do things. And oftentimes, if you could just find them and get them the basics of it, make it safe for them to do it, they'll go off and do great things without permission, that can turn out to be very consequential. And so there aren't a lot of new business techniques you can say that about. They almost all require a fair amount of top-down support. But I honestly think that's the beauty of design thinking. You can do a lot of it under the radar and actually change people's lives and shift the conversation quite dramatically without anybody's permission at all. And that makes it very unique.
It does, and it is something that, but we also, I mean, one of the things that the people who are teaching design thinking to do business people and to within organizations, one of the things that I think we are also seeing and learning is that, for instance, to take me as an example, I started, teaching people about design thinking and the kind of the whole kind of, and we use the double diamond, for instance, but this whole process. So from start to finish, the whole flow of design thinking. And then I slowly moved into like, oh, wait a minute, that might be a bit much, because
Yeah.
people are like,
Yeah.
whoa, that's, especially if you do that in a day or so, what do you expect people to take from that? But what we're seeing now, and what I have been doing the last few years, is that actually I'm teaching them also like little things,
Yeah.
like just do this little thing, or hey, you do stakeholder analysis, and stakeholder management, that. But here's a little tool to visualize that. Very simple. It's just a bullseye. It's rings of influence. You put it there, and hey, you have this. It's not an Excel sheet. It looks different, and you can kind of have a different conversation, because actually now it's about how, where do you put that stakeholder, how influential are they, et cetera, and it changes the conversation, and people are like, you can just do it. All right,
Yeah.
just do that. All right, okay, see you next week. Or here's another one, which was oddly enough one of the most used little tricks. One of my clients is something they all tried and they all loved it, and it changed the conversation, the meetings they had. It's just, we call that the 5 seconds of silence. And it's actually something Meeta Patel, you also know.
Mhm.
I think I learned that from her, and we were running a training together, and she did this 5 seconds of silence. And so now every time I go like, just try in next meeting you have, if you ask a question, you go like, anybody, any questions? For instance, you just count to 5 in your head slowly, let the
Mhm.
silence sit.
Yeah.
And this will
Power of silence.
change the rhythm. It will change because people will expect, first it's really odd and awkward, but then people are start to get used to it. And there's this space to breathe, to think, to say something, to say, oh, wait a minute, I have a question. Or, so 5 seconds of silence changes your meetings. That's great, because it's
Yeah. Yeah.
humanizing it, instead of
And
going like,
that is the interesting thing. I think at some level, what I believe at least, is the true transformational power of design thinking is an end-to-end process, right? There's tremendous synergies in putting the pieces together, right? So you can go off and do ethnography all you want, but if you don't know how to pull that into a process, and you don't know how to have a conversation to get your stakeholders in, and then if you don't know how to test it, you're not going to be able to produce the really significant results. On the other hand, you can do a lot with the small stuff too. So it's this kind of,
you start small. You say, let's start here, and then we build from there. Then you do this, and you do a little extra, and so it's giving people sort of permission, first of all, to do something different, very safe, very small, take a step, because again, we're in this system that will resist change. Not people. The people are smart. I mean, everyone I work with, they're bright, they're smart, they get it. It's not rocket science. It's okay. Why don't they do it? Because they don't have the time. They have 30-minute, Zoom calls back to back, and they get the way their success is being measured. It doesn't align with what I'm teaching them. So these are little things we can kind of make sure that they can change something. And so yes, they need to kind of move into this design thinking, or this very different way of approaching projects and doing things differently. But when you start with people who've never heard of that before, and they don't know how, instead of teaching them, the back-to-back system or the flow of design thinking, giving them at least a few starting points, going like, okay, here's a little thing. I've learned that has impact, that makes them hungry for more. Something else that happens, by the way, if you teach people design thinking, which is funny, if you teach them design thinking, often this is kind of odd, because often they go like, I want to work like this forever.
yeah.
And I love it too, but it means that sometimes they just leave their job.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's true. I had one student say one time, I've been carrying around a lock and my whole life, and you've handed me the key.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Isn't it beautiful? Especially because for MBA students, it's the first place in the curriculum that they feel at home, people like that. We used to call the class the land of the misfit toys in business school, because literally people felt like they were finally the ones who really just got it, whereas in finance and accounting and all the other classes, they were the ones who were like, huh, could you explain this to me? And then you're finally talking in a language that makes sense to them. And it's so liberating. It's all they want to do. You know,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Yeah.
what.
And I used to work in finance, and I remember when one of the design thinking books came out, it must have been around 2011, 2012. And I remember I would get home from work, I'd go on my little balcony and I would read my book. And I was like, what am I doing working in finance? This is what I want to do.
Yeah. No, this is where I belong, right?
Yeah.
And people have that, there's that group of people who've just been waiting for it. I mean, and and a lot of this for business people is the power of the front end of design thinking. I mean, I have to say, it took me like, what, 10 years to finally get around to the testing part, because the front part is so incredibly emotionally engaging and
Yeah.
valuable, right? And this connection with customers, and this ability to work with people who think differently than you do, and kind of the magic of higher order solutions that can come out and get created there. It's so powerful that for so many years we would do all that with students and everyone would be all excited, and then we'd get to testing and it would be like, oh my God, this is terrible. And we'd say like, okay, now go off and design and execute some experiments.
Yeah.
And I mean, it doesn't, it's the part of the process that doesn't have the emotional like magnetism of the front end of the process. So the people who love the front end are the ones who are least likely to have any interest in the experimental part. But as much as I believe in design thinking, I think in some ways experimentation skills are even more broadly necessary and even more undertaught
Yeah.
business
Yeah.
schools than the front end of design thinking. I mean, I think we've finally
Yeah.
gotten a notion where you'll
Yeah.
find customer journey mapping actually is snuck into like the marketing class, and people who would never have anything to do with it. But I just always had the feeling still that as educators, no one really knows what it means to design an experiment, right? And I always felt like I was doing an injustice to the back end of the process, right?
Yeah.
But still, I mean, it's so odd to me. So, one of the things that I often find myself doing if I work with a company, often it's the business people, or maybe it's IT, maybe it's HR, that I have to remind them of the origin, the roots of their company, because the roots of, unless I'm proven wrong, I think all companies started with experimentation. The
They
roots of
started with
all companies,
entrepreneurs for sure.
right? They started with trial and error.
Mhm.
So where did they forget? And then we started teaching design thinking, and people go like, oh, this is really scary. I
Yeah,
go, where did you just think about, where did your company start? And
yeah,
even now, and I work with companies that are, their main business is innovation, like technology, for instance. They sell technology, and that's their business. So they have these labs and they have these innovation spaces, but they are always hidden somewhere, or and I go, well, even if you create a new one, if you have to create new shampoo, there's someone somewhere trying out, new recipes and seeing if your skin responds to it well, and et cetera, et cetera. Someone is doing trial and error. So the
yeah,
scientific method, or the entrepreneurial method, or the design thinking method, I think it's a very human problem-solving method. That's how we go through life. We try
yeah,
stuff out and we learn because it fails. And we go like, oh, won't do that
yeah.
again.
I think in some ways the experimentation piece is equally psychologically unsafe in business organizations for
Yeah.
completely different reasons. I think, first of all, with experimentation, you've got this fundamental fear of failure, right? So no matter how much we tell people to go out, experiment, innovate, try new things, we mean don't ever fail.
Yeah.
Because getting it wrong, I mean, we could talk a lot about the mindset of a venture capitalist. They expect 2 of 10 businesses to work. And in business, the rest of the world, we expect 10 of 10 to work.
Yeah.
And the reality is the physics of uncertainty around innovation are, don't build a system that assumes that you're going to be right. Build a system that assumes you're going to be wrong and work with that one. But I think it's, I mean, Carol Dweck's work on mindsets. From the time we're children, we equate being smart with being correct. And so the idea that you will treat failure as a learning opportunity runs counter to, not only our personal, but every organizational culture that was ever built for the most part, right? So I think just there's this huge psychological impediment. And then the other thing that I come to believe is, businesses are intensely data driven, but they are never hypothesis driven. So when you're doing experimentation, you have to be hypothesis driven in your use of data. So you start with the hypothesis and you say, what data do I need to test it? Where do I find that data? And if it doesn't exist, how do I create it? In business, we start with the data that we're given. We've got our income statements. We've got our official, our systems, our data systems spit out a bunch of data, and it's almost never the right data for experimentation. I mean, when you're trying to do something new, existing data that gets spit out from a system is almost always the wrong kind of data to do the test, but we still try and use it to test anyway, right? And so getting people to flip between starting with the data to try and answer the questions, to starting with the hypothesis and then go find the data, right? That is the skill set of strategy consultants by and large, but it's not anybody else's skill set. I mean, we just don't teach hypothesis-driven thinking for the most part. So that's another big barrier, even with our data-driven MBAs. When I used to teach a consulting elective, it would take half the class before they would flip the switch. And when it flips, people get it. Oh my God, this is a completely different way of dealing with data, right? And it's calling different things data. It's really changing your definition of what is data, right? But we don't generally do that. And if you look at the business world today, forget design thinking, which is my first love. If you talk lean startup, if you talk agile software development, they are all based on experimentation. Almost all of the new methodologies are experimentation based. And we don't even have any idea how to actually teach anyone to actually design and execute good experiments. Until you get to the sophisticated A/B testing, R&D stuff. But that's not what most people in organizations need. They need a much more basic version of what does an experiment look like, right? But we don't teach that. And I feel like experimentation is now where design thinking was like 12 years ago, when design was just a black box and we didn't have tools and we didn't know how to teach it other than for 4 years in design school or something like that. That's where we are now with experimentation. It's just a black box and it's this murky thing and no one is comfortable doing it, but not really admitting that they don't know how to do it. And our whole notion of what constitutes an experiment and data, they're wrong, given what we need, but we're not addressing it yet to any great extent. And it's a lot less fun and sexy, unfortunately, than the front end of design thinking.
Which is odd, really. Which is, to me, it is kind of odd. I mean, I love the front. So I was always inspired by this professor from the Technical University in Delft. He talked about the fuzzy front end of innovation.
The fuzzy front end. Yep.
And I was like, yeah, that's where I live. I like the fuzzy front end. That's where
Found my
I like
people.
to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, my people are there. Yeah, exactly. But to me, experimentation is, that's part of that fuzzy front end, because it's allowing that kind of, again, it's this divergent moment. Convergent moment. Sorry, you converge again, diverge again. Sorry.
Mhm.
I'm getting tired. You diverge again. You diverge in the sense that you look for sort of you don't mind if it's wrong. And one of the things I've always said when we go do prototyping, for instance, early prototyping, which is part of experimentation, early prototyping. I always say, if you come back with your prototype and your conclusion is that it's perfect, something went wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to know what's wrong with your prototype. That's the mindset. I don't want to know what's right. I want to know
Yeah.
what's wrong. Break it.
Yeah.
Go break it. But
Yeah.
it's really difficult because I remember working for the Philips Design. This is a very long time, so I think I can say because they don't do this anymore. Philips, it was part of a project where they needed going to the next stage because this was a stage gate kind of process. And so there was a venture board, and they needed to show what they were doing to the venture board to get more money to move to the next stage. And so they created what they called a prototype of this, and it was a lot of technology involved. But the prototype, I think that it cost them like $100,000 or something. People are sweating that it should work. They put something together
Yeah.
and it
Right.
had to work. That's not a prototype.
It's not, yeah, right. I mean, that's way too, and I mean, that's one of the problems. People's notion of prototyping is this expensive, sophisticated, slow thing,
Yes,
which,
right.
I mean, I think one of the things that business people have most trouble with at the front end of design thinking is the small sample sizes, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
So people will say, how can you go off and, propose this new product when you only interviewed 18 people? I mean, that's not statistically significant and stuff like that.
right.
And the way we get them comfortable with it is we explain that, we're used to using data only for proof. In design thinking at the front end, you're using data for inspiration, not proof, right?
Mm.
So you're not trying to prove anything. You are trying to
Exactly.
inspire
Exactly.
more creative ideas. And so the fact that you don't have a statistically significant sample absolutely doesn't matter. If you talk to one person and
Yes.
they inspire you to think differently, then that was
Yes.
good, right? One was good. Now, the trouble
Totally.
with that is you can't scale something if you've only used data to inspire. At some point, when you're trying to actually move a product into a real organization and implement it and scale it,
Exactly.
you do need proof. And design thinking's front end doesn't give you proof.
No.
So
Exactly.
you need experimentation. Otherwise, you're going to be scaling all kinds of stuff that contained assumptions that maybe worked with 18 people, but didn't actually work when you get to the bigger market, right? So
Exactly.
I think design thinking really needs the proof that experimentation brings,
Yeah.
but again, usually by the time we get to testing, you're out of time. You've already taken a lot of time. You've spent a lot of money, and people are like, "Well, we're sure it works. We love this
Mm.
idea, and so it's a hard sell."
No, so I think I had one of those moments where the penny drops. Because in the last few years, I've always talked about the gap that we've been seeing for years that design. So to your point, the front end, design thinking, we live
Mhm.
there. There's so much going on. We train people. We're there. But then when I talked about implementation, the hardcore implementing part of whatever comes out of the workshop, for instance,
Mhm.
because often it stops there. And especially the early days of design thinking and service design, we did lots of workshops. They were amazing. And people were like, yeah, it's so great, cool. And nothing ever happens, like the brainstorms.
Yeah, yeah.
You have all these ideas and nothing gets implemented. So I always saw, and actually a couple of years ago, I wanted to start a company, in that gap of how do I bridge design thinking, that part to the hardcore implementation of whatever product service you came up with. How do you do that? And so your experimentation sits there.
Yeah, it's in that.
That's in that gap, right?
It
It's
does.
bridging
It
that.
does. And so this new
Awesome.
book on experimentation, I think I've been trying to just unpack and demystify
Yes.
experimentation the way we've successfully done design thinking, I think.
Mm.
And again, it's not as much fun It's clearly, it's not as sexy. It's harder to kind of hook people with it and get it, you know, and get it, especially people who love design thinking. That's why I've somewhat backed away from trying to position the experimentation as the back end of design thinking, because I think it kind of exists in its own right, and it's a necessary skill in and of its own right, right? Now, without the great front end of design thinking, you may not be experimenting with very many interesting and valuable things.
Yeah.
You need the front end to give you something that's worth doing an experiment on.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But the skills are so different in the front end and the back end that I think you almost have to decouple it, at least emotionally, to really do the experimentation part well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, and that's I don't know, it's interesting. We've gone the template route. I think templates are, I used to think they were a tool of bureaucracy. And then I was writing a case about a museum director. And he was talking about trying to get the curators to have a completely different view of what the museum was about. He was trying to build interaction with the community and this note. And he said to me, the only way I can get the curators to do anything is I create some simple little template. And he said, and the most difficult, resistant person, when you give them a template, will actually fill it out. And once they filled it out, you have the basis for a conversation.
Exactly.
And a conversation that's different. And so this notion of using templates as a way of luring people into a different kind of conversation, that's really been like the underlying leitmotif of my life for the last 15 years, I mean, I went from being anti-template to being like, well, if there's no template, nobody's going to do it, I mean, obviously. So it's been funny, even the role that those have played in figuring out how to kind of lure people into these new ways of thinking in ways that somehow make it feel safe and normal to do this stuff that really is not safe or normal.
You were making it on your computer the night before. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's been my life also the last, 20 years or so.
Yeah. Isn't it funny?
Yeah.
Tools of bureaucracy subverted to get people to change. I don't know. I kind of love the idea.
They're connectors. They're bridges. The whole conversation we've been having is about bridging and connecting, and I think that's, we live in the time where we talk about, that there's so many differences, and we are. I think that we need bridges. We need connectors. We need to kind of, right? So we need to find those. I read this in this book, The Movable Middle, sort of like, what do we share? What are the things we share? So the canvas is a tool to kind of share something. It's my thinking, but it's also your way of thinking because it's a tool. It's a canvas. It has lines. It looks sophisticated. So you're safe, but it is, my vision is in there. So we find a middle ground. And sort of, we need people, and we're not going into politics, but still, we need those connectors.
I do think that for me, one of the most powerful ways to think of design thinking is just a better way of having conversations across difference.
It's a language, and I've been teaching sort of people in business for a client. So there was another agency. They were doing work with the researchers at this client, and the researchers were doing consumer research and what have you. So, and then I'm teaching people in the business, and I didn't know about, because it's a large organization, I didn't know they were doing that. So she reached out to me saying, "So, are you're teaching design thinking to these people, right?" I said, "Yes," because can we kind of combine notes and connect and our training, because they should speak the same language, because they don't understand each other, because the business people ask for research, and the researchers go like, that makes no sense. And then, and vice versa. So having a common language is powerful. Having the words, that, and knowing what they mean, and sharing the same language is I think, that is what creates reality. That's what creates sort of your understanding of something. And
And then you bring in a set of rules for the conversation,
Yeah.
like respecting, listening to understand,
Exactly.
trying to build on each other's and I think the combination of those, the language and the way you have the conversation. I mean, that's
Exactly.
where, again, we're back to the notion of a designer as guardian of a conversation, right? A leader no longer is in the conversation answering it. You're guarding the conversation, right?
Yes.
So that we're ensuring that kind of the rules of the conversation, of the way we listen, the way we build on each other, the way we challenge each other, and use difference productively.
Yes.
All of those kinds of things, that's the role of the leader, right? So that the conversations that happen can be ones that have some shot at setting the preconditions for these kind of outcomes that are really transformational and that really are, in a co-creation sense, higher order solutions that are better than what any individual brought into the room, right? But unlocking, I think, that potential of difference is a challenge, because it's so easy for difference to have exactly the opposite effect, which is kind of the world we're living in now, where difference divides us and makes it impossible to listen and understand and move forward, rather than fueling more creative thinking and the ability to see possibilities that we wouldn't see otherwise. I don't know.
I want to ask the last question, and which is because I do want to know kind of what your thinking is of the future, and what is the thing that is most important to you in the next coming years?
Well, I am retiring officially from the university at
I
the
heard
end
the
of
rumor.
this
I heard the
academic
rumor.
year.
Yeah.
So I have this wonderful, like, blank sheet of paper.
Lots of possibility. Yeah.
Lots of possibilities, right? To suddenly do whatever I feel like doing when I feel like doing it. So I'm just looking forward to kind of continuing the conversation, but maybe in a broader way, since I'll have more time to have the conversation outside of kind of university responsibilities to show up and teach my classes and all this kind of stuff.
Those
So
things.
I don't know what the future holds. I'm kind of just remaining open to the signals, Life has been very good to me in terms of popping up opportunities. I used to joke that I'm like the Forrest Gump of business professors. That I just meet people, like going to class, but like being in school with Roger, or my office mate at BCG was Clay Christensen. Meeting these amazing people, or like I made that Coursera course. Coursera kind of like suddenly appeared out of nowhere. So we did this little course, and now 400,000 people have taken it, So
Wow.
I'm a big believer in kind of opportunities showing up. So I'm just excited to kind of see what shows up in the coming years and where it takes them.
Brilliant.
That's
Thank you so
exciting.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you for the conversation. Really, really loved having you on the show.
Oh, well, I loved talking to both of you. Loved meeting you, Morgan.
Yes, thank you. Likewise, Jeanne.
Yeah, and looking forward to seeing you in Amsterdam in
Yes.
October. So